by now, but good morning. Thank you so much for dialing in. As I see, the room continues to fill up, so we'll start getting into it. If you haven't met me before, my name's Luke Achterstraat. I'm the CEO of Commtract and have been with the business for about 4 years now. For those of you who don't know much about us, just a quick sort of overview. You may be aware we're an online platform for communications professionals. And what that really means, I guess, is two things. Firstly, we're all about jobs and contracts. So if you're looking for short-term work, freelance work, consulting opportunities, we'd like to say we're the home of those opportunities in Australia and New Zealand. But equally, if you're an employer and you've got gaps in your team, you need to scale up and scale down. We've got, a platform of more than 4,000 vetted communications professionals ready to go, from assignments as short-term as a few days, all the way up to maternity leave contracts and even longer-term assignments. So that's what we are. But we're a little bit more than that. We also are big on advanced professional development. We're a community, is the best way of putting it. And events like today, these webinars, are really about trying to give back and I guess keep the community engaged. And at the end of the day, if you're not learning all the time, if you don't learn something new, what's the point? So we thought, hey, let's crowdsource the very best talent we have in our network and hear from them, the real experts, and learn and move on from there. So on that note, we're very lucky, we're very thrilled, in fact, to have Larry McGraw with us today, talking about Australia's infrastructure boom and are we ready? A little bit about Larry. When we were thinking about, who can we get to talk about infrastructure, he really does have the all-round credentials. He's worked in politics as a chief of staff to the transport minister and as critically to the treasurer, and more recently has been an executive on the leadership team at the John Holland Group. So he's very much a leader in both the public and private sectors on infrastructure. He's overseen the delivery of major projects. And I must say, not just from a communications perspective, but from a procurement, planning, operations, finance, service delivery perspective. So he's very much across, the broad range of, the magic pudding of big infrastructure projects and what that means, and really keen to get into it today in terms of, his perspective on the current market, the current environment. Are we ready? Do we have the skills? And also, in light of COVID, how are we going to manage these major projects? How are we actually going to see them through to fruition? So that's Larry's background. And also, I will just quickly embarrass him. In 2019, he was named by the Australian Financial Review Boss magazine as a Young Executive of the Year. So very much, a highly capable person who's widely respected in the infrastructure space. So on that note, Larry, firstly, mate, thank you for making the time, and we're looking forward to today.
Oh, thanks so much. Really, really great to be here. Thanks to Commtract for the opportunity.
You're very welcome, mate. So I guess as we sort of talked about on our call the other day, let's just do a bit of contextualizing. I'm really interested in your assessment of where we are in the infrastructure life cycle. We've seen the Prime Minister come out and say that, the government's seeking to fast track 15 major projects worth around $72 billion. And that follows the states and territories lining up to also try to fast track as many projects as possible in light of the COVID crisis. I guess, in your mind, with your experience, where are we now in the infrastructure cycle, and I guess what's the status quo, if you will?
Yeah, okay. Great question. So just before we kick off, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I am on today, which is the Wandjil people of the Eora Nation. And the area I live in has been occupied by Indigenous people for at least 4,500 years, probably much longer. So I want to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and also extend that to any Indigenous people on the call today. So where are we at in the infrastructure cycle? I kind of like to think of it as we're sort of entering the third wave, if you like, of the East Coast infrastructure boom. And so what do I mean by that? Well, it sort of kicked off around 2011. Things were starting to heat up in the infrastructure market, but the mining boom started to soften, and a couple of things happened at around that time. And most particularly was the election of the O'Farrell government, who had made a very significant number of promises around very big projects. And the East Coast wasn't really used to delivering projects at that time, and so there were a lot of planning documents done, and it really all kind of kicked off with Sydney's rail future and Sydney's light rail future, which Transport for New South Wales did, and therefore the Northwest Metro, what eventually became, and the CBD and Southeast Light Rail and WestConnex, and that really started the boom that we were in, and it was all pretty new. There was lots of creative procurement going on, lots of different governance models. You had WestConnex, which was kind of sitting outside of government, some projects with their own advisory boards. It was all a bit fast and loose, but you know, everyone got the hang of it pretty quickly. And then those projects started to get delivered, and you saw the other states starting to think, well, we should be doing a bit of this as well. Particularly down in Victoria, and the Andrews government coming in there. And so then the second wave, I would say, started with those second round of projects that were largely funded by what started as a major round of asset recycling. So you had poles and wires in New South Wales, things like the Port of Melbourne in Victoria, funding projects like City and South West Metro, Melbourne Metro, Westgate Tunnel, and everybody wanted a slice of this pie because they could see that the infrastructure side of things for politicians was becoming quite an attractive proposition. So even Canberra Metro, Cross River Rail started to come on board finally. But the interesting thing around that phase to me was what happened to the contractors, and they started to swell massively in size, and really they were the only ones that could do these mega projects. And there's not many tier 1 contractors out there. So John Holland, for example, doubled its workforce during that period, which was a very small amount of time to do that in. And I remember in 2017, when I was there, we bid 4 mega projects, which was very unusual. Normally you would only bid, say, 1 a year. We bid 4, and we won all 4. So you saw this huge explosion in the percentage of mega projects that contractors had on their books. And then, as we all know, some of the risks started to crystallize on some of those big projects, and things weren't quite what they seemed. And you know all the projects that have had their own difficulties, but they all started to come home to roost, both on governments and on the infrastructure contractors as well. I remember somebody asking me, you know, when will the government stop pushing so much risk back onto the contractors in this unsustainable way? And my answer was, oh, well, when they only get one tender in the tender box. And then that happened on Rozelle Interchange, and we ended up with the 10-point plan. And then that's led us now into, I think, this third wave, where risk is top of everyone's mind. Community is now seen as a much bigger focus, I think, of a lot of these projects than it had been in the past. And we're seeing this new wave of projects starting to come out in that space. North East Link in Melbourne in particular, and West Metro here in Sydney, I think will define that third wave. So it's a very interesting time. You know, we've gone through a lot, but the East Coast infrastructure boom doesn't show any sign of stopping or slowing at all at the moment. It's just evolving, I think.
Excellent. No, thank you, Larry. And Matt, I guess to build on that, in light of being in that third wave, and you mentioned the East Coast boom, it's not slowing down, it's going to keep chugging along, if not accelerating. Do you think we've got the capacity, the skills, and I'm sort of more talking from a community engagement, comms perspective here, sort of appealing to our audience today. Have we got that right? I mean, is that going to be, are those skills under pressure at the moment? Are we able to sustain this sort of third wave that you're talking about?
Okay, so do we have the skills? Yes, unequivocally, there are fantastic people out there. Where I think it gets inconsistent is the recognition and the empowerment that those people are given on individual projects and in individual teams. That's definitely something that I've observed, and that happens on both the private and the public side, I would say. So you'll have some delivery agencies that absolutely live and breathe the community side of it, and the stakeholder engagement side, and that's everything. And ultimately, it's driven by leadership. You know, if you see a mega project being delivered where you can't identify a person in the senior leadership team of that mega project who has either communications or community or engagement or stakeholder in their title, I would say that's going to be a problem. You know, it is genuinely one that comes down to how empowered are those people to actually make decisions. Can I give you an example of where I've seen that work very effectively? Is we actually, at John Holland, we had a project in Singapore, and Singaporean government is incredibly focused on community and stakeholder issues. And this was a road project. It was a station box underneath a 6-lane freeway, and very difficult to build because it was cut and cover. So it was closing off different parts of the freeway. It sort of had 9 different possessions through the life of the project. Horribly complicated, lots of road diversions, messy. And the community person identified that right next to the highway was this massive set of apartment blocks with a big front garden. And it had always been assumed, well, you can't go into that because that's their huge front garden. And so she, as the community person, went and started speaking as she was, doing her engagement stuff with the apartment residents, and started to sound out, well, what if we took that front garden for a period of time and moved the freeway all the way over there? She ended up pitching it to the project director, who saw the dollar signs and the time savings and everything, pitched it to the client, and they ended up actually completely changing the way that the project was delivered. And that all came from this engagement person, one, having the ear of the project director, and 2, having the empowerment of the project director to actually go off and make change and try and make the project as best it could be. And to me, that's where we need to get to, is we need to get from really quality engagement with the community to actually starting to even more add value to the actual project and to the community by improving things as the project goes on.
Yeah, that's fantastic, mate. So it sounds like really giving our function the imprimatur and the respect it deserves, in major projects, and a seat at the leadership tables is really critical. And I'd love you to build on, maybe in your experience, managing the team at John Holland from a skills development perspective, how you sort of nurtured those skills and really built that culture in your team. And just before I let you do that, I just want to remind the audience, please ask questions. So I'll have a couple more for Larry, but through the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, I'll just remind you, please keep the questions coming in. I've had a couple of comments starting to churn in, which is great, but keep those coming and we'll get to those shortly. So bear with us. But Larry, yeah, keen to just sort of build on that skills development. How have you sort of invested in your time at John Holland and really raised that capability level?
Sure. So first of all, I'd say I was blessed to have an amazing 2IC in Ashley Jarquin in John Holland, who has now taken over my role since I've left, which is fantastic. And to be honest, she did most of the nurturing. She's a fantastic leader, and she really did a great job bringing the community side together. But I mean, one of the early things I discovered when I started there was we had these community engagement specialists right across the world, and they were not linked up in any way. They weren't connecting with each other. And you could really quickly see that a lot of the issues that they were facing, while they were specific to each individual project, they had a lot of similarities in their own issues. Trees, for example, kept coming up, knocking down trees. It's just something that is always going to be there in an infrastructure project. And there should be a level of, well, this was best practice and we did it in this way. And so, I developed this thing called Community Central in John Holland, where we would actually became this center of excellence, effectively, where we got all of our community and stakeholder people together frequently and shared ideas. And there was some amazing conversations. I remember one we had where we had the person who was doing WestConnex M4 East and the person who was doing Northwest Metro, and you couldn't get 2 more disparate community views on an infrastructure project than those 2 projects. And just watching them share how they were dealing with their own issues was just fantastic. So it really was about empowering them as well, and making sure that community and stakeholder and broader comms actually had that seat at the table. And I think I was lucky enough to be able to do that because I was on the exec and reported to the CEO, which I think is to me is an essential in the large construction companies these days. It's you've got to be able to have that direct line.
Absolutely. No, I fully agree. And I think we see that in a lot of the organizations we work with, really ensuring corporate affairs has a seat at the table, as you say, and a line of sight to the leader of the business. And look, it links really well to a question we've just had come in from David Bezier. G'day, David. Thanks for joining us again today. Larry, which is actually about trust. So I think it links quite well to this element of being on the leadership group. So thank you, David, for this question. David says, in Edelman's Trust Barometer Report 2020, business is seen as capable but unethical, and the government as inept and unethical. So David asks, what do infrastructure developers need to do to improve their social license? Not to put you on the spot there, Larry, but
no, it's a fantastic question. And I mean, I think it gets down to purpose as well, and what you're actually in it for. And you know, we went through an interesting process at John Holland where we went out and spoke to all of our people as we created an organizational purpose as opposed to a mission or a vision or something like that. And it was really interesting when you talk to the engineers, or, you know, really anyone in the business, people that work in infrastructure, you only get so much time on the planet. And so you only have so many projects that you've worked on, and people are genuinely rightly proud of the projects that they've worked on, but they don't come to you and they say, you know, you should have seen the amazing margin that we squeezed out of the government on this bridge project. You know, we hit them with so many variations, and, you know, we really dragged them over the hot coals on this job. You know, that's not what they're going to tell their kids. They tell their kids, you know, we did this bridge and it was amazing. We connected the communities. It doesn't open up anymore and block the traffic on school holidays. You know, the community was so rightly happy with it. So there's this complete disconnect, I think, between what individuals within infrastructure organizations feel personally about what it is that they're doing. They have a real pride in what they do, and the way that the community experiences that sometimes. So I think it's about breaking that down, and it's about lifting up the purpose of what you're actually doing, and ensuring that that doesn't get forgotten once it, you know, filters up into a senior leadership area where, you know, dollar signs are kind of the main priority. I think, you know, you have to have that really robust community engagement to be able to get that through to the community, and you've got to be genuine about it. You can't let that drop.
Yeah, absolutely, mate. No, look, thank you for that. Thank you for being so generous with your response there. A follow-up question to that was, I did want to ask you about COVID-19 and how that's having an impact. And, you know, a lot of the work we've done with Commtract lately, I guess, has been trying to carve out, you know, the future of work and what does that look like in a COVID or post-COVID era. And by that, I don't simply mean we're going to work from home a bit more, because I don't necessarily think that's true. We'll have to wait and see. But really, what are the skills we need, the responsiveness, the agility? So I'd be keen to get your thoughts on that as a sort of, you know, seasoned leader. How can we skill ourselves for the future? But in addition to that, on the COVID topic, another question, and I know you're an urban geographer by training, so I thought this would be a good one for you as well. So yeah, my one about the future of work, but also COVID-19 and what impact will that have on urban density planning? Very interesting question.
Yeah, very interesting question. And I think just on you know, the future of cities, and on, I mean, there's so many different ways that you can look at the impact of COVID-19 on urban planning. Even just the change in power. You know, there's a lot of, I go up to my local coffee shop and you see all these really important business meetings are now happening locally rather than people going into the city and having them. And so there's this really interesting dynamic going on, which I think, you know, it would be brave to say that we know where that's heading at the moment, but I think it's definitely a return to some degree of localism. You know, the death of the CBD, I think, would be greatly exaggerated to say that that's going to happen, but it's definitely going to be different. So I think there's a really interesting paradigm shift happening there, and you've kind of got these dual issues at the moment, which are, you don't want to have as much capacity on the or as much crush on the public transport network because you need a bit more distance between people, but at the same time not as many people are traveling. So it's sort of, there's kind of this balance that's occurring at the moment. When we get comfortable with more density on public transport again, what's that going to look like? Are we just going to have too many services running? So I think it's way too early to kind of predict how that's going to play out. In terms of future of work, for the infrastructure sector, I think it's going to be very positive. I was talking before I left John Holland, I did a couple of welfare checks on our project directors just to see how they were tracking as the working from home side of things started to kick in. And one of, I would say, our most conservative, you know, old school project directors, who had been very against what was an already underway process of bringing more flexible working into John Holland. He now had 40% of his workforce working from home. You know, the engineers, all of the kind of office people on the project. this is a mega project. And he said to me, if you try and bring things back, you know, when this crisis is over, there is no way I will follow and toe the corporate line, because I poured 5,500 cubic meters of concrete, which is an absolute record for me. He's like, we are more efficient. There's less make work. There's less meetings going on that are unnecessary. So I think we'll start to see a little bit more, maybe more efficiency, I guess, in the way that those things start to work. Hopefully, if people start to use online task management tools, this sort of thing, to keep track of where things are going, you like to think that we'll actually be more efficient in work. I think we need to manage the work-life balance issues and the mental health issues very carefully through this. There are people, particularly single people, who struggle without the social contact of being at work. And so I think that there's so much that we kind of need to work out through this. I think it's a positive thing. I think it's made people more relaxed. I mean, here I am wearing a t-shirt today, and I've actually got Ugg boots on. So, you know, which has kind of made people a bit more authentic as well. So which, you know, leadership was heading that way anyway. So it's kind of just given it the nudge that it needed.
Excellent. Mate, for the record, I've got board shorts on, so it's complete. This is an Ugg boot free zone, but you know, it's each to their own. Mate, really interesting perspectives there. I wanted to talk about internal communication. So you've just talked about, do we really need all these meetings? To what extent are these make work, you know, concepts? In an infrastructure context, given there's a lot of joint ventures, how do you manage your sort of internal comms systems? You've got potentially different platforms, you know, a diverse workforce underground. How have you sort of overseen that? Because I think that might build on quite nicely from the future of work conversation.
First of all, I am a huge internal comms advocate. I honestly cannot understand why sometimes it doesn't get seen as being as sexy as external comms. I find it fascinating. It's so crucial to modern workplaces. Maybe if I can just give you the example that I went through at John Holland. When I started, we had 2 internal comms channels, which was, we had a thing called The National, which was a kind of black and white paper newsletter that got sent to offices, which was an interesting title for the newsletter, given that John Holland is an international business. So I'm not quite sure what the people in Singapore and New Zealand felt when they were reading that. So we had that, and it was crummy. No one read it. And we had the intranet, which was also, and still is, a kind of cumbersome tool, and it's not built for storytelling. So Ashley and we kind of went through a journey of, well, let's get some channels up first. We need to be able to communicate with people more. And JVs make it really hard because you don't necessarily have the same IT system as the people on the JV. They might be using the other joint venture party's IT system. And that makes it really hard to get to people. So we just found we weren't getting through to people. So we really broadened out the internal comms channels, and probably the 2 most significant ones that we did were, John Holland now produces a quarterly full gloss magazine all around storytelling, and we send it to every single one of the 5,500 people that work there, to their home. It's an expensive exercise, but it's incredibly effective. You really, probably the most effective thing that it does is it builds pride and therefore retention. It's a great way of telling stories. And we also found that you'd be able to talk about, you know, it was a complete mix of stories. So we would have one story here would be about tattoos that people have, and you'd have all these pictures of shirtless blokes and stories about why they've got their tattoos. And then the next one would be about some hook that a bloke had developed on the Melbourne Metro project to specifically lift something that hadn't been lifted before. And then the guy in Sydney Metro would look at that and go, oh, that's brilliant, I need something like that. They'd get in touch, they'd swap information. And then the other thing we did was we brought in I guess you'd call it a ground up comms platform, which was Workplace by Facebook. Revolutionized the business completely. There was a massive amount of pushback around the introduction of it, particularly from legal. You know, how do we control it? You don't control it. You know, we can come in and edit stuff if someone posts something that's offensive. You have the terms of use, but there was this panic that everyone is going to get in there and start slagging off each other and bullying each other. just didn't happen. It became this fantastic tool for sharing information for any large organization these days, particularly with a young workforce. We had 50% of our workforce were millennials, so the technology was intuitive to them. It made an incredible difference. And in fact, before I left, we had an exec team meeting, and as part of a professional development thing, we were doing this thing on perceptions and how you might let your perception or your level of risk get in the way of innovation. And everyone had to go around the table and list something that had happened at John Holland that they thought was going to be terrible and ended up being great. And half the room said Workplace by Facebook, which was pretty interesting in a room full of engineers. So it was a really, and still is a really great tool. There's others out there as well, but the good thing about it is most people have Facebook, so it's a logical way of kind of getting through there. So yeah, look, internal comms is going to become even more critical, particularly working from home. We need innovative professionals in this space to kind of keep pushing the boundaries and fight the fight against legal.
Absolutely, and I think it does link back nicely to our theme of sort of corporate affairs being elevated and being on that leadership group to really, I guess, demonstrate at that executive level the importance of internal comms as well as external comms. And as you said, I do believe internal comms should be seen as just as important, if not more so, than the typical sort of sexy media relations that our industry often falls into the trap of abiding by. We've got time for a couple more questions. Speaking of the sort of executive level, Larry, so look, gender diversity is obviously a big issue in infrastructure.
Yeah.
I had a question right in to say, do you think, in fact, that the infrastructure sector suffers from a lack of gender diversity at the executive level? A two-part question, and have you seen any positive momentum in recent months or years?
Yeah, great question. So first part is yes. I'd suggest it's not just gender diversity, but it's also ethnic diversity and also, sexuality. It's a hard place, hard industry to be part of the LGBTI community in. There have been far few enough women, particularly at the exec level, in construction companies. When I started at John Holland, there were no women on the exec team or on the board. Now that has changed, but there's still not enough. And I have seen some positive momentum around it. For example, a range of companies, John Holland included in the sector, have eliminated their gender pay gap over recent years. And, that's been a massive step forward. We still need to get better around, my big focus was around when women return to work after having children. It's a very difficult industry to work in, and that all gets around flexibility. And I think, I hope that the COVID-19 experience will actually be a massive step forward for women in the infrastructure sector, because we've all shown that the flexibility that we need, you don't need to be in the site office from pre-start, through to 6 o'clock at night. We've shown that we can do it without that. So I'm hoping that and job sharing and a range of other different things will help in that way, but we need to see more women at the leadership table. Absolutely. The way I look at it as well is 10 years ago, there were nude calendars on the walls of site offices. There's not many other industries in Australia where that would have been the case. So the message I used to say at John Holland was, if we're pushing to get to where we need to as a modern business, it will feel like a lot of change coming quick, because we need a lot of change coming quick, because we were so far behind. So yeah, look, I do think it's improving. Is it going fast enough? Probably not. I think it just needs that constant pressure, and it needs to be driven from the CEO.
Excellent, mate. Look, I fully agree with that. I think you've absolutely nailed that. Lots more work to go. And yeah, again, coming back to this theme of really getting the leadership team to drive such critical initiatives. Folks, we're pretty much at 11:30, and I have to say that's absolutely flown by in a very positive way. We've had quite a few questions come in, so we haven't got to them all today, but what we might do if we're cheeky is circulate them to Larry and maybe try to get some of his written responses, and we can send those out to you guys in a sort of a form of blog post. But I thought just before we wrap up, just wanted to maybe give Larry the chance to reflect on, where we're going to be, or project rather than reflect, the next 12 to 18 months, what's ahead. Obviously, a lot of uncertainty. We're seeing governments really try to green light as many infrastructure projects as possible, to bring it back to the beginning of the conversation. But are there any sort of left field risk factors or big themes that we can expect in the next 12 months? Larry, from your view, what should we be looking out for?
I think probably the biggest thing in the infrastructure space at the moment is that none of the tier one contractors are making money. So that is a fundamental, incredibly large problem in the infrastructure sector at the moment. That is I think is probably the single biggest risk to the sector. And I think what we need to see is a sensible management of risk between government and the private sector. There's a couple of questions I've noticed coming around that. Look, that's happening, but again, it's one of those things that's not happening fast enough, and it's not happening consistently. Every state is taking a different approach, and every contractor is taking a different approach as well. So we somehow need to wrap our arms around that, because we can't continue the infrastructure boom without the tier one contractors. And I think what we also need to see is more of the tier twos stepping up and being able to do some more of that work as well. Definitely from a comms perspective, the way I always used to talk to my team was, I would say, I do not want us to be the best at internal comms or external comms in the construction sector, because that bar is way too low. The sector needs to go through a bit of a revolution in terms of its standards and accept, an ASX 50 style standard. So there's still a lot of work to do, both around comms and around engagement, I think. You're seeing that starting to happen, but it's a very challenging environment when the contractors aren't making money, because unfortunately still, which is wrong, you end up seeing community and comms and things seen as the nice to haves and the project itself as the must have. So it's a tricky time for sure for the sector. But I think, we've got to look at the sector's continued. It hasn't shut down here like in New Zealand. Projects are still going, people are still employed. And it's an amazing time to be working in infrastructure with the amount of projects in the pipeline that's out there. So it's a positive time overall, just issues rich.
Absolutely, mate. No, great to hear that enthusiasm and optimism about the future. I mean, you wouldn't be optimistic about the future of the sector, otherwise you wouldn't have put your shingle out as to be an advisor.
That's right.
Your newly formed business, Rainhill Advisory. So I look forward to following your journey over the next 12 months as you and beyond, as you move into consulting, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more from you. Guys, I just wanted to thank Larry McGraw. I thought that was fantastic. Really, deep, meaningful insight into the sector. He's been on each side of the coin. I think provided really great insight, and there was a lot there for all of us, even from a non-infrastructure background. I'm not specifically from the infrastructure background, but a lot of key takeaways that I think translate into various industries from a communications perspective. So thank you, Larry. Also, thank you to the attendees. We had a great turnout today, some familiar names, some new people as well. So thank you, folks. We had 10 or a dozen so questions. That was great. We'll try to address more of those in the coming days. We'll be sending out a survey as well. So if you enjoyed today, let us know. If you've got other ideas for themes, topics, ultimately we do this for you guys. So let us know what you're interested in, fill out the survey. And just lastly, there will be a recording of today's webinar going up on our social media and on our website, etc. So please feel free to share that with any of your colleagues who may be interested and pass it on. But on that note, Larry, mate, thank you very much for that. Wishing you all the best.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Thanks for listening to everyone who dialed in as well. Thanks to Commtract. Cheers.
Beautiful. Thanks, Larry. Cheers. Have a great day, folks. Thanks again.